The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm very pleased to have occasion to bring this important matter to the floor of the House of Commons, because there's an important decision pending for the Minister of Finance, which is whether or not to approve the RBC-HSBC merger. And what we're debating today is a very concrete and simple recommendation of the Finance Committee of the House of Commons. In its 12th report to the House, was very clear that a majority of Finance Committee members do not support that merger going ahead. And there's at least a couple main reasons why New Democrats are concerned about this merger going ahead. The first is that we know that right now Canadians are living through very difficult circumstances. Their household budgets are under severe stress because of rising interest rates, because of the rising cost of all sorts of necessities of life, whether that's housing, whether that's home heating, whether it's the cost of groceries. And every little thing right now means a lot for Canadians who are struggling to make ends meet. And we know that even before the pandemic, something like half of Canadian households were only $200 away from insolvency at the end of the month. And we know that that has only got harder, and we see the effects in our community, whether that's the longer and longer lines at food banks for people struggling to feed their families, or whether it's more and more folks homeless and living on the street. And you know, I've just had the opportunity to travel with the Finance Committee to many different cities across the country, and that was something that was a common theme, no matter whether we were on the East Coast or the West Coast. There are tons of folks right now who are no longer housed, and the problem of homelessness is increasingly visible as more and more Canadians can't make the rent payment at the end of the month, or can't make the mortgage payment, and have nowhere to go. Indeed, some Canadians who are gainfully employed just can't find a place to live that they can afford. And so it's no longer the case that it's just folks who aren't able to get a job, or who have a disability and aren't able to work, who are finding themselves homeless, but we're also hearing from folks who do have a reasonable monthly income, what would have been considered reasonable just a few years ago, who can't afford a place to live on that, and so are having to figure out how to work a full day and come back somewhere to a tent or a spot that they found under a building with a little bit of shelter, feed themselves, go to sleep, and wake up and get looking presentable in the morning to be able to go back to work, which is certainly a real challenge, and not one that I would wish on anyone. It's why we need a government that's going to act with a much stronger sense of urgency in respect to the housing crisis. But one of the other things that Canadians have struggled with for a long time are the fees that banks impose in order to be able to do business at their institution, to hold your deposits, to write checks, or more and more, to withdraw from ATMs or do e-transfers. And we know that in Canada, Canadians pay high fees for that. And one of the reasons that they pay high fees for that is because we don't have a competitive banking sector in Canada. We've pretty much got 5 big banks that I think have over 90% market share when it comes to banking in Canada. So you think about that, that's not a lot of players in the market. In economics, they call that an oligopoly. And while it may not be an oligopoly on paper, it's certainly an oligopoly in practice. So now what we have is one of Canada's largest banks, RBC, proposing to eat up the 7th largest bank in Canada. And the difference between those two banks is considerable. HSBC is not a huge player, but it's a player that is scrappy. I think if you were to look up the mortgage rates right now, they're offering mortgages at over 70 basis points lower than what RBC is offering them at. And historically, HSBC has offered mortgage rates that are considerably lower than those at RBC. The government in the fall economic statement just rightly announced, and this is something New Democrats have been calling for folks with insured mortgages to be able to shop around and transfer their mortgage without having to undergo the stress test again. Well, this is exactly the kind of move that Canadians would be looking to make. If they have a mortgage with RBC, they may well want to go to an institution like HSBC that's offering over 0.5% less in terms of the rate for that mortgage. Clearing the way so that they don't have to take a stress test is important, but it ain't going to matter if HSBC gets gobbled up by RBC and then is offering that same rate. That means Canadians will have won the right to transfer without having to undergo the stress test, but no longer have somewhere to transfer to that's offering a better rate. And so that's why we think it's important that the government say no to this merger in order to preserve one of the few non-Big Five players in Canada that there is at all, particularly when they do have a track record of exactly the kind of effect you would hope to get from competition, which is competitive pricing on mortgage rates and other services. We know that because the Big Five have been relatively unchallenged, it also means, and we just went through this in Transcona since I got elected, the TD branch on the corner of Regent and Bond shut down. And we don't really have a lot of bank branches in our community anymore. Thankfully, Manitoba has a strong credit union movement that I'm very proud of, and I'm a proud member of a couple different credit unions. Yes, there are many in Manitoba. I know we have a former board member of one of those credit unions in the House here today. It's a wonderful thing. I'm very proud of the credit union movement in Manitoba, and it's really only because of the credit union in Manitoba that we continue to have local branch banking available in our community, because the big banks have all but fled in an attempt to reduce costs. But that leaves their consumers wanting to have the kind of traditional relationship that they've had at a local branch and unable to get it. Why is it that the big banks can get away with that? Because they don't have sufficient competition. So as I say, I'm glad I live in a province where I think the credit union movement is filling an important void with respect to banking services. Also glad that I can say that I get my banking services at a credit union. That was in jeopardy not that long ago with the government looking at changing the Bank Act to outlaw us talking about doing banking at credit unions, and I'm glad that common sense prevailed and people can say that what they do at a credit union is their banking, and that the banks didn't get their way on that. Just as I hope that the big banks aren't going to get their way in respect of this merger, because competition is what is going to provide for lower rates for Canadians. I think it's also important to mention, and I don't want to mislead anyone. It's not that HSBC is some kind of second environmental coming or something like that. But they were the first bank to offer green bonds. They have made some pretty serious commitments and backed it up with investment plans to lower the emissions profile of their investments. That's exactly the kind of thing that we need to start seeing in the financial sector if Canada is going to meet the legal climate commitments that we have signed on to in the Paris Accord and elsewhere. And RBC, on the other hand, is the bank that does the most fossil fuel heavy investment in Canada today. And they're an important player, for instance, in the government's TMX project, and have put up a lot of capital for that. But they're very invested in growing the fossil fuel infrastructure in Canada, despite the fact, and I think it's easy to forget this in the kinds of debates that we hear about the oil and gas sector on the floor of this place. The oil and gas sector in Canada is extracting more barrels of oil today than at any other point in our history. So for those who say that the industry is in distress or it's on the verge of extinction, I would just say let's take a deep breath and look at the facts. And the facts are that, in fact, the oil and gas industry in Canada is more prolific today than at any other point in our history. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's employing more people than it's ever employed, because as technology advances, jobs for workers and the profitability and productivity of the oil and gas industry are on separate paths. The truth is, oil and gas companies are able to extract more and make more money than ever with less workers. And so the continued advancement and increase in extraction is no longer tied in the same way it used to be to the creation of jobs for people in Canada, which is not to say that there aren't still a lot of jobs in the oil and gas sector, and it's not to say that that isn't important. It's to say that we need to find the right level of extraction that is sustainable for the planet and that provides a strong economic basis for Alberta and other parts of the country where that industry is really important. And so all that to say that RBC really is driving the let's grow and grow and grow and grow with no sense of sustainability or no sense of what would be a sustainable rate of extraction. And so both on the environmental front and on the consumer protection front, there are strong reasons to oppose this merger. It's why opposition parties on the Finance Committee sent, I think, a very clear message by working together that this was not a good idea. I don't know that Conservatives would endorse some of the environmental concerns that I've raised on the floor today. I wish they would. I think Canada would be a better place for it if we could talk more about these issues in a serious way and how to get Canada's emissions under control. I know that's not a conversation we want to have, but I'm glad that we at least can agree on the need for more competition in financial services and what that would mean for Canadians. And I think it's an important signal that the government should not ignore that so many parties in this place, for their own reasons, don't think that this merger is a good idea. Now, I would also say, we're going to hear at some point from Conservatives on this matter. I think Canadians should take what they have to say with a little bit of a grain of salt. I know they're talking a lot about the Competition Bureau these days and the importance of competitiveness. And of course, this merger was looked at by the Competition Bureau, but not under the new framework that's on its way, both through C-56, which just passed committee last night. That's going to make some important changes to the Competition Act. And then also coming, if you look at the Ways and Means motion, in the Budget Implementation Act that the government will be tabling, presumably after a vote on the Ways and Means motion. More changes to the Competition Act coming. This merger was not reviewed with any of the new powers that will be afforded to the Competition Bureau. It was reviewed under a regime at the Competition Bureau that even the federal government itself recognizes as being deficient. But we know that, in the past, for instance, Conservatives have talked about wanting to have independent officers do work without political interference. I've certainly heard that at committee. I'm glad to hear that, but I remember them setting up the Parliamentary Budget Office, for instance, under Stephen Harper in the early days, and that was a good thing that they did when they did that. Then the Parliamentary Budget Officer started saying things they didn't like. Shocking. And then the campaign of character assassination began, and Kevin Page, who was the first Parliamentary Budget Officer, came under direct attack by the Harper government. And so it wasn't that great an outing for the Harper government after all. They did the right thing initially, but they couldn't stay the course because they can't stand any criticism. And they react badly as soon as someone starts calling them out for things that they'd prefer to get away with. And so I think Canadians should be taking some of the remarks that the Conservatives are making today as an opposition party with a grain of salt when it comes to their desire for an independent Competition Bureau. And I certainly hope that in the future, if we have a Conservative government, that we won't see that government decide to attack the Competition Commissioner if he starts telling them things that they don't want to hear. Because the whole point of having those independent offices is to be able to do that. We saw it again with David Johnston, someone that at one point they held up. They held him up to the point that they were willing to appoint him as Governor General of the country. And then when he started saying and doing things they didn't like, a campaign of character assassination began. And I think that was unfortunate because it detracted from the important point, which was that when it came to being a special rapporteur on foreign interference, that wasn't the right way to proceed. And making it about David Johnston detracted from the important point, which was that was a bad process. And what we really needed was a public inquiry. And I'm proud to say that New Democrats stayed the course and finally got that process on track. But I don't think that the personal attacks against David Johnston were helpful in that regard because they detracted from the main issue. And Conservatives were so concerned to attack David Johnston that it took them a long time to work with us in the right way to get that process back on track. So again, just another example of where Conservatives claim that they want certain people in positions of authority to be able to make pronouncements on what the government of the day is doing, but then as soon as those pronouncements aren't in line with their partisan lines, all of a sudden it's a problem and it's an affront to democracy and the character assassination begins. So I think it's important that we take this moment where Conservatives are prepared to do the right thing. Those moments are few and far between. We shouldn't waste the opportunity. The government should be listening and take the opportunity itself to do the right thing and say no to a merger that is both going to set the private financial sector back in terms of green financing, potentially, and also a merger that is going to maintain and reinforce the lack of competition that Canadians have already been suffering under for too long and have had to therefore pay some of the highest banking fees, even as those same banks reduce service in their community and close local branches. So those are some of the reasons why we think it's really important that the government take this opportunity, not do what it did on the Rogers-Shaw deal, which was to ultimately cave to those big corporate interests. We talk a lot in here, and I think rightly, about corporate-controlled Conservatives, but we shouldn't forget that the Liberals do their fair share of corporate service here in this place. After all, that is the true coalition in Parliament between Liberals and Conservatives serving Canada's corporate sector. And so, you know, now we have a real opportunity here, as I say. One of those few and far between moments where the Conservatives are prepared to do the right thing in opposition. Let's seize the day. You know, the Rogers-Shaw merger, and the minister likes to say he put conditions on it and everything else. I'll tell you, I mean, some of the things that you can expect to happen did. I had somebody from BC call me up and say that he had been a Shaw customer, and when the merger happened, Rogers sent him a new SIM card and he had to figure out how to put it in his phone and everything else, and he hadn't done that yet. Took him a couple months, as sometimes household administration does. I'm sure there are many Canadians listening or sympathetic to the fact that sometimes it's hard to stay on top of all those things, particularly if there's a technological component that you're not familiar with. So what was happening? This merger that wasn't going to have any negative consequences for Canadian consumers. He started getting a bill from Shaw because he hadn't changed the SIM card yet, and he was getting a bill from Rogers. So he's getting two bills from the same company for one cell phone, if you can believe that. Well, unfortunately, I can, because I know what it's like to deal with some of these big telecom companies and other corporate oligopolies, whatever the sector. And the fact is, it's very hard to get justice as a consumer. That has been true for Canadians in respect of the big five banks, and this merger is not going to help. It's going to take a smaller player out of the market that is doing its work to be scrappy and to offer competitive rates. That's not what Canadians need, especially not in a time of economic strain and financial strain. What they need is more competition to be able to deliver lower prices and take a little bit of that strain off their household budget. Just as the government is bringing in new rules to make it easier to transfer your mortgage when your term is up, is not the time to take competitors out of the market that are offering lower rates. Those are the HSBC is one of those very banks in terms of its lower offering that Canadians are going to be looking to in order to save money in their monthly household budget. Let's make sure that those options are there, just as Canadians get the freedom to transfer their mortgage without having to undergo another stress test. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question Kamal Tyre, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Seat.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Canadian banking system is sound, stable, and free from political interference. It has served Canadians well through the 2008 Great Recession and during the COVID recession itself. I would ask the member, why does members opposite continue to politicize a pillar of our economy?
The Honourable Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, of course, most companies in an oligopoly are sound and secure. That's kind of the point, isn't it? They have the market power to be able to ensure that their own business is sound and secure. The problem is they're doing that on the backs of Canadian consumers. And why we want to see more competition in the financial sector is so that Canadians don't have to pay for the soundness and security and peace of mind of bank CEOs. We think that's backwards. And we think that it's the job of this place to ensure that Canadians' interests are put first, not the interests of wealthy bankers. And that's why we continue to say that it's important not to approve the merger and keep a scrappy, smaller player in the market to provide more competitive pricing to Canadians.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Bay of Quinte.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think the Conservatives, NDP, surprisingly, we all agree that competition is broken in Canada. We certainly at the Finance Committee agreed that the HSBC-RBC merger is a product of that broken system. There's broken laws that we have to fix. Everyone has brought new laws in. But the biggest thing that's going to change banking in Canada is going to be consumer-led banking or open banking. Does the member agree with the bill that I've brought forward, that this party has brought forward, that is going to push the government to bring competition to Canada, which means consumer-led banking, which means many different fintechs which will compete and lower the price of banking for Canadians?
The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
I do certainly support open banking. I think that's really important. And, you know, for folks watching at home that may not be familiar with the term of art, open banking is just a term that says you should own your financial data. And so when you're banking with an institution, they shouldn't be able to say you can't take this information and share it with another institution. That's your information. It's your finances. It's your money. And if you want another institution to know the facts about your account, the current financial institution that you bank with should have an obligation to share that without a bunch of silly business or putting up walls or making it difficult for you to shop around and get a better price. And so, as I say, we believe that there's not enough competition in the financial sector today and that Canadian consumers are paying a serious price for that, and that needs to change. It's why we oppose the HSBC-RBC merger, and it's why we support open banking.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. L'honorable député de Avignon-Lamétis.
The honourable member for Avignon-Lamétis-Matane-Matapédia. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. CP reported earlier this year that the Royal Bank was the biggest lender in the world for fossil fuel projects in 2022. And the amount was $42 billion US in 2022, according to a study that's $3 billion more than in 2021. $4.8 billion went to the oil sands and the rest to fracking. According to the same study, since Canada signed the Paris Agreement in 2016, over $253 billion worth of U.S. had been given to oil companies. So my question is about what is the responsibility of the major banks in all this? And does the government have a duty to legislate to force the banks to phase out their lending to the oil patch and instead improve investment in clean energy? The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona. Thank you very much for the question. I think one of the very important issues in terms of this merger is the issue of the environment. There seems to be no limit on investments in industries that produce greenhouse gas emissions. So one of the major questions that the government should consider in reviewing this merger and acquisition, whether or not to approve it, is that we need some clear green taxonomy for the investment industry so that portfolios are greener, and I don't mean greenwashing, truly greener portfolios, investment portfolios. And this would encourage institutions to start, like HSBC and so on. They should not be gobbled up by another bank like RBC if they're truly committed to, if they don't want to increase greenhouse gas emissions in their portfolio.
Fanshawe. Oh. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I very much appreciate the member's speech today. And I just wanted to ask if the member could expand a little bit about corporate greed and really what underrides these decisions to amalgamate and to buy out competitors. If they could just, if the member from Elmwood Transcona can just explain how this hurts consumers.
The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, thank you. I mean, one of the important issues that's at play in changes to the Competition Act, and if you look at the private member's bill of the NDP leader, the member for Burnaby South, is the question of killer acquisitions, where companies buy up smaller competitors before they get the market share to become competitors to the bigger players in the industry. So here we have a bank that is quite small compared to the big five, but has shown that it's willing to price its products competitively, and Canadians can benefit from that if they so choose. Again, they're going to have a better opportunity to benefit from that after new rules come in not requiring them to take a stress test when they transfer their mortgage. That won't help very much if the smaller player that's offering the better rates disappears in between now and when those measures come into effect. And so absolutely, corporations, in the name of gathering up market share and making bigger profit, do try to acquire and shut down smaller competitors that are undermining what otherwise is a pretty comfortable pricing environment for those bigger players. It's something that isn't in the interest of Canadians. It's in the interest of those larger companies that already have dominance within their market. And it's something that, as legislators for the public interest, we should be concerned to stop, not encourage.
Questions and comments. Question commentaire. The honourable member for London Fanshawe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the things that really concerns people in my riding is that disappearance of financial institutions in maybe neighborhoods where they don't see it as financially convenient for them in that big business market. And one of the things that we had been pushing for was postal banking. Now, the government did start it, kind of not successfully. Even though it was a success on the ground, they seem to have abandoned that pilot project. And I wanted to hear from him how that could also help in terms of, just like credit unions, providing an alternative for people to have more power over their banking situation.
The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you very much for that question. And as I said in my speech, it is certainly a concern for folks in my riding as they've watched bank branches close and access to financial services get more difficult for those who care to do it in person. And there's still a lot of people in Canada who want to have a direct face-to-face relationship with the people that are in charge of their savings. And so postal banking would be a great way to do this. As I said, I'm very proud of the credit union movement in Manitoba. I think they show for sure that, you know, if smaller financial institutions like credit unions can have brick and mortar branches in our community, sometimes more than one for the same credit union, it's certainly possible for the larger banks to do it, but it's something that shouldn't fall through the cracks. And I think through the infrastructure of Canada Post, we have an excellent opportunity to make sure that banking services are available in every community, in addition to whatever the private financial market through credit unions or banks or others are going to provide.
One time for a quick question and answer. The honourable member for Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Mr. Speaker, so very quickly, we appreciate the NDP support on our motion here, but will they join us in delivering more than just words, in fact action, and in voting non-confidence if they allow this merger?
For Elmwood Transcona.
Well, I would just gently remind the member that actually we're debating my motion of concurrence today, and I was very glad that they brought the issue forward at the Finance Committee with my support. I think that shows that it really is an act of true collaboration. And as for confidence votes, we'll take those as they come. And as long as the government continues to deliver on the CASA commitments, we will continue this parliament. And, you know, but we are certainly in the midst of some important negotiation on pharmacare. That is an issue that we think is election worthy. I'm not sure that getting a corporate controlled conservative government is the answer for Canadians if these guys are willing to approve the merger.